Chapter 1. Please, baby, please just get me through these gates and up to that front door. Maggie Montgomery pleaded with her '77 Chevette, even as her gaze took in the enormous circle drive that led its winding way up a hill to the cream mansion with the stately pillars beyond. Oh, Lord, what am I doing here? This has got to be the craziest thing I've ever gotten myself into. Trying not to think about how her beat-up navy blue two-door looked on the grounds that were perfectly manicured, right down to the yellow and red rose bushes, Maggie steered the car around the concrete that was edged with white stones the size of her dresser back in her dorm room. At the apex of the circle, she put the car in park and heaved a sigh that might well be her last. With a push, she resettled her glasses on her nose, grabbed her 2-page resume, and shouldered the door open. Just breathe, she told herself as she stood on legs wobbly from the 3-hour car drive. Pine Hill, Texas, and the Ayer mansion seemed a million miles from Gold Dust Drive in Del Rio. It was still Texas, but the similarities stopped there. Of course, she was in her best dress, a floral print that was a size too big. That was better than the heels, which were at least 2 sizes too big. They were the best Mrs. Malinowski could do on 10 minutes' notice. The grace of God alone had gotten Maggie this far, and, truth be told, she wasn't at all sure how much longer His patience with her would hold out. Listen, Holy Spirit, I know I'm probably over my quota by now, but please, please let me get this. I don't know what I'll do if I don't. The remaining $2 in her purse crossed her mind, pulling her spirit down. Defiantly, she squared her shoulders and pulled herself to her full 5 feet 7 inches. Every step was pushed on by a prayer. The 6 wide steps up to the front door nearly did her in. But finally, after 17 years of struggling just to survive, she was here, one knock away from something more than a minute-by-minute existence. She reached up and rang the doorbell. The wait was worse than the walk. Nervousness raked her hand up her purse strap. Seconds slid by, but nothing happened. What now? Should she ring it again? She looked back at her car and fought the fear and desperation rising in her. Just before she bolted from the whole idea outright, the door clicked and then opened. On the other side stood a small Hispanic woman dressed head to toe in white. "Hello," Maggie said, corralling her purse strap even as she held out her other hand. "I'm here about the nanny position." "Doesn't anyone know how to follow a simple order anymore?" The bellowing, jowl-ridden, over-paunched, balding man at the desk fumed, shaking his head even as he continued to make notes. "I built a whole company, put in oil wells across this state. Midland, West Texas, South Texas, even 3 in the Gulf. And now my own son can't get one simple, solitary task carried out without messing it up." "Dad, it's not that big of a deal. Q-Main and Transistor will be ready for the track in 2 weeks. We just need a little more time with Dragnet. He's not where he needs to be yet." Keith Ayer fought the urge to shift in his chair. Laid back and nonchalant was by far his best bet with his father. That much he had learned so long ago he couldn't clearly remember when it had happened. One-on-one, head-to-head confrontation had never gotten them anywhere. He clasped his dirt-stained hands in front of him and set his stubble-strewn jaw. His dad was tough, but horses weren't his specialty. They were Keith's. Racing a thoroughbred, especially one with as much promise as Dragnet, before it was ready, was the best way he knew to ruin one permanently. No amount of blustering changed the fact that Dragnet simply wasn't ready. "I talked to Ike this morning. He's thinking we can bring Dragnet up for a wheel race sometime in July." His father exhaled hard, clearly not pleased with the assessment. I paid $250,000 for that animal, and I don't like watching my investments sit around eating me out of house and home. The fact that house and home weren't exactly in jeopardy crossed Keith's mind, but he wisely chose not to say that. Would you prefer to sink a $250,000 investment by racing him too soon? Trust me on this one, Dad. A little patience now could hold out big rewards later. His father scowled, his expression sinking into his jowls. I didn't build a billion-dollar empire on patience. Then he nodded. You've got 2 months. May? That was too soon, but it was all Keith would get, and he knew it. I'll tell Ike. He started to stand and felt his father stand as well. Never a good sign. I know my way out. Yes, but you also know your way back in. That's what concerns me. The laugh that accompanied the statement tried to pass it off as a joke, but it felt more like a knife to Keith. His father followed him right to the door and out. So, have you heard from Dallas? How's she doing at Yale? Law school going okay? In the hallway, Keith replaced his beat-up, loose straw cowboy hat back over the blue bandana stretched across his head. Good, Keith answered with the obligatory nod. She should be back for spring break. Graduation's in May. Hayden and Elliot after she passes the bar. To infinity and beyond. I like that, his father said, with the first smile Keith had seen from him all afternoon. At the staircase that wound to the upper floors, his father stopped, looked up it, and smiled. Well, well. Keith's gaze followed his father's up the carpeted just-so steps, and although he first noticed his stepmother next to the railing, he stopped dead when he saw the young lady descending between her and the wall. Of course you will get time off occasionally, his stepmother Vivian said. Her suit dress was perfectly pressed all the way up to the ruffled collar that ringed her neck like a flower. That was Vivian, always impeccable, lest anyone see she wasn't perfect. However, I need you to realize that this is basically a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week job. Oh, yes, ma'am. That's not a problem, the young lady with the mesmerizing head of chestnut brown hair, which was falling out of the clip she had in the back of her head, said. She pulled the strap of her purse up onto her shoulder. She was coming down, trying to keep her gaze on Vivian out of respect and attention, but she clearly could have used the banister Vivian was using as her own. The descent was anything but graceful, more halting and awkward. In fact, she was having so much trouble keeping up with everything that it was 2 steps from the bottom before the young lady with the dark glasses and cascading tresses even noticed there were others watching her descent. Her glance from Vivian to the 2 men standing at the bottom threw her attention from the concentration she was obviously exerting to get down the stairs for 1 moment too long. As Keith watched, 1 step from the bottom, disaster struck. He saw it as it happened, but it was like it was in slow motion. She stepped down with her left foot, but her shoe planted awkwardly in the plush carpet. Her ankle turned, and like a puppet falling to the stage, her body pitched forward with a jerk. Ah! Her scream lasted all of 2 seconds, the exact amount of time it took for him to realize what was happening and reach out to snag her downward motion, which would have pitched her unceremoniously to the hardwood floor of the entryway had he not stepped between her and certain humiliation. Oh, watch! It was all he got out before she thwacked into him. Ugh. The impact of her body on his didn't so much as move him, although it was significant enough to jar her glasses askew. It was only the clasp of his hands on her arms that kept her from bouncing off of him and ending her descent on the floor next to him anyway. When her unscheduled tumble came to a complete stop, she was sprawled across him, from his shoulder to his arms, which supported her without effort. In fact, it felt more like holding a weightless butterfly than anything. "Oh my gosh, I am sorry. I'm so sorry." Mortified, she yanked herself upright from him, although she looked as unhinged from the encounter as he felt. His insides were dancing with amusement and fascination as he watched her disentangle herself from him and wobble on the uncooperative shoe once more. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." She was standing, readjusting her dress, her glasses, herself. "I don't know why I'm so clumsy today. Are you all right?" Keith asked, gazing at her as if he had just fallen under an angel's spell. His hand stayed out to catch her again, if need be. Yes, I'm fine." Perturbed with herself, the young lady shook her head quickly and resumed her attempt to look like she belonged there, which she didn't. At all. And somehow, he kind of liked that. He smiled at her, but she was clearly doing her best not to look at him. "You sure?" But she had resumed her concentration on Vivian. "Conrad," Vivian said with no small amount of a frown at the ineptitude of her current interviewee. "This is the young lady I told you about, Maggie Montgomery. She's come about the nanny position?" "Oh, yes," Keith's father said. He extended his hand to her, which she shook even as she continued to fight to get herself under control. "It's nice to meet you, Miss Montgomery." "I have explained to Maggie," Vivian continued, "that she is on a 6-month probation period. Anything not up to our standards during that time will be cause for immediate termination." Maggie's gaze fell to the stairs, but she pulled her head up and looked right at Mr. Ayer with a forced smile. "And that's acceptable to you?" his father asked. "Yes, sir, it is." She looked like a proud filly with her chin up and her hazel eyes flashing determination. "I suppose you will need 2 weeks to let your current employer know you are leaving," Vivian said with a sigh, and Keith couldn't help but notice the dramatics. She should have been an actress. "Oh," Maggie said, and he heard the note of concern. "No, ma'am, I can start as soon as you need me to." She pulled her fingers up through her purse strap. "I can start now, if that works for you." "Wonderful," Mr. Ayer said. "That's what I like, someone who can make decisions." "You don't mind starting today?" Vivian couldn't hide the pitch of excitement. Maggie turned to her. "Right now is fine, if that's what you need." She was intriguing, mesmerizing, captivating. And yet, just why that was, Keith couldn't accurately tell. She was nothing like the girls he'd been out with, they with their debutante good looks and impeccable manners. No, this one, this Maggie Montgomery, looked more like a nervous high-strung pony, proud and strong, and determined not to be broken by anyone. "Well then," Vivian said smartly, "let's go meet the children." "Good luck, Miss Montgomery," his father said, extending his hand to help her down the last step. "It's nice to have you." All the air had gone right out of the room as Keith's gaze followed her down the hallway and out of sight in the direction of the children's wing of the estate. "What are you still doing here?" his father asked, surveying him. "I thought you had horses to train." "I'm on it." With that, he exited the main house and descended the front steps. There in the driveway sat a car that Keith couldn't even be sure still ran. It looked like it would be a better fit for a junkyard than in front of his parents' house. As he started past it, the thought occurred to him that it belonged to her. Her. Maggie Montgomery. Well, it'll be an interesting 2 weeks anyway. With a knowing smile, he strode on. He shook his head at his own joke. They never lasted more than 2 weeks. Never. In fact, he wouldn't have lasted more than 2 weeks, but for the simple fact that they couldn't get rid of him. He was a member of the family, whether they liked it or not. "This is Peter," Mrs. Ayer said, indicating the small boy with the blonde hair sitting at the table coloring slowly. "And this is Isabella." She picked the little girl with the bright blonde curls up into her arms. "Hello, little one." Maggie reached a hand out to the soft little face. "You are a sweetie pie." Mrs. Ayer slid the little girl back to the ground and planted her hands on her hips. "Dinner is promptly at 6 p.m. They are to be dressed and ready no later than 5:30. Inez will be able to fill you in on the rest of their schedules." Maggie nodded, taking in the information with a sense that even perfection wouldn't be good enough. "If you'd like some time to get settled, I can get Inez to watch the children for a few more minutes." "Oh no, I think I'm fine." Then she remembered, "But I do need to move my car. It's still out front." Mrs. Ayer sighed with disapproval. "Very well. You may park it over at the guest house. It's just through the back, down the lane, and off to the right." "It'll only take me a few minutes," Maggie said, trying to assure her new employer that she was competent enough to handle all of this. "You may as well bring your suitcases in as well. Your room will be at the top of these stairs, right next to the children's rooms." "I'm sure I can find it." "Inez?" Mrs. Ayer called out the door. "Yes, ma'am." Maggie couldn't clearly tell how the maid had been able to answer so quickly. It was as if she had materialized there from thin air. "Please watch the children while Ms. Montgomery gets her things settled." Inez bowed slightly. "Very good, ma'am." Once more Mrs. Ayer surveyed Maggie, and the fact that she didn't believe this would ever work traced through Maggie's consciousness. "If you need anything else, let Inez know." "Yes, ma'am." "And now you'd better get that car moved before Jeffrey has a cardiac." "Yes, ma'am." Something told her she would be saying that a lot now. Pleading with her heels to cooperate long enough to get her back to the car and then back here, Maggie hurried out. The early afternoon Texas sun beat down on the outside surroundings. After having been in the comfort of the mansion's air conditioning, the combination of humidity and heat hit Maggie like 2 fists. She got in the car and took her first real breath. "Oh, thank you, Jesus." Except for the unceremonious stumble into the hired hand, the interview had gone as well as she could have hoped for. "Ugh, how clumsy can you be, Maggie? That was a good one." Forcing herself not to think about it, she pumped the accelerator and twisted the key to get the little car started. Then she carefully backed up so she could go down the back drive as Mrs. Ayer had instructed. With a frustrated swipe, Maggie pushed the trail of loose strands of hair from her face and then blew them back up when they didn't stay. Carefully, she drove around the house, which was enormous no matter which angle it was seen from. Her heart pounded in her ears as the car slipped into the grove of hulking trees. Trees seemed to be everywhere. Somehow she had expected them to dissipate beyond the mansion, but if anything, they got more massive and thicker the farther she drove. Did she say right or left? Intensely, Maggie scanned the areas on either side of the driveway that had narrowed to a trail. "This is great. I get lost on my first day." Then just ahead, off to the right through the knot of trees, she caught sight of the place. When she got closer, Maggie sucked in a gasp of air. If this was the guest house, they certainly treated their guests very, very well. Sporting orange-tan brick with blue-gray accents, the house had a bevy of inlets and cutouts. There were enormous windows and wraparound accents at the corners, and an inlet door that looked like it alone cost half the national debt. Wow. Wide-eyed in awe, but trying to keep her mind on her present mission, Maggie surveyed the small hill of a lawn, the flower beds, and every inlet for some clue as to where she was supposed to park. She turned her gaze up the trail. Surely there was a garage somewhere. Oh, Jesus, help. The trail dovetailed with a small perpendicular drive just beyond the house, and carefully she turned there, hoping maybe this was right. In fact, there was a garage, but the moment she pulled up to it, she had second thoughts. What if someone needed in or out of that garage? If she was parked in the way, that would be a problem. Twisting her mouth as she tried to find an answer to this dilemma, her heart jumped into her throat when her gaze caught movement in her driver's side mirror. Fear jerked her head around just in time for her to see the hired hand with a blue bandana sticking out from under the ratty cowboy hat come striding up the side of her car. For a moment, she felt better, but it was only for a moment, because the reality of being out here alone with no knowledge of the terrain if trouble struck, with a guy who felt like the Rock of Gibraltar, did nothing to calm her nerves. She swallowed hard. Very cautiously, she reached up and locked her door, praying the others were already locked. "Hey," he said when he got to her window. His easy smile spread across his face as she rolled down her window just far enough not to be rude. "Fancy meeting you here." It was impossible not to notice his biceps, which looked like massive tree trunks streaming down from the ripped-off sleeves of his denim shirt. In a fight, she would lose without him even trying. "Hi." Panic smashed into her and her lungs constricted around it. Mrs. Ayer said I could park here, but I'm not sure where she meant." Anxiety had never meant what it did at that moment. "Oh, she did she? Well, that figures." He laughed, which threw her incomprehension devices into full throttle. "Nah, it's okay. Swing around back here, we can put it in the barn." Maggie nodded, although no real signals were getting to her brain. She rolled up the window and backed onto the driveway so she could follow him down the increasingly narrow trail. From behind, he was all denim, save for the bent straw hat and those arms. Oh, dear God, I don't know about this. Please tell me if I should be doing this. But as far as she could tell, God was not giving her any other options. At the end of the drive, mercifully, the trees broke their hold on the surroundings, and she drove out into a clearing and down a gravel road over to the building he had called a barn. But like everything else here, barn didn't quite do it justice. He swung the 2 doors open and stepped back so she could drive in. Crossing from outside to in, the darkness enveloped her eyes so that it took her longer than it would have seemed necessary to make it safely into the building. Once inside, she shoved the car into park and then had to corral her fear to gather enough courage to open the door. "Oh God, be with me. I'm asking here." Busying herself, lest he see just how scared she was, Maggie got out, went to the back, and unlocked the trunk. With a heave, she pulled her lone suitcase out, praying it wouldn't fall apart at her feet. "Oh, here, let me get that for you." He reached out for it even as he stood at the door that stood open. "No, I can get it." She tried to swing it out of his reach, but with a soft smile and a wink, he took it anyway. "It's half a mile back to the house," he said. "In this heat, you'll be French fried by the time you carry this thing all the way back." Her heart was beating so loudly, her brain didn't have a chance to put up a logical argument, so she nodded, ducked her head, and stepped past him. The bright sunshine beyond the door attacked her eyes, and she squinted as he closed the barn door behind them. Everything in her wanted to take that suitcase back and run, but barring humiliating herself against his strength again, she saw no way to do that. The gravel at her feet was playing havoc with her heels, and she fought to keep her balance and stay up with his strides as they started up the incline to the guest house. He wasn't tall exactly, maybe a couple inches taller than her, but no more than that. But the solidity of everything about him swept the air from her lungs just the same. "So, you work here?" she asked, willing her voice to stay steady even as her shoes threatened to pitch her into the sharp white rocks at her feet just as they had pitched her into him at the mansion. The thought made her ears burn. "Yeah, as little as possible." There was that smile again, and if she hadn't been so nervous, it might have had a chance to do serious work on her insides. "I run the stable operation up the way." Stable? Her brain was having trouble processing anything. Horses. Oh. They made it back up to the trees, and uneasiness pushed into her consciousness again. She looked around, and the trees seemed thicker now, closing in on her, blocking all escape routes. "I hear you're going to be on the payroll too," he said. "Oh, yeah, I am." "Well, you must be downright impressive. Most of the time, they won't let anyone within shooting distance of this place that doesn't have security clearance from the Pentagon." They had made it to the main road and headed back to the mansion. Crossing in front of it now, the guest house was even more impressive going by slowly, if that was possible. Maggie fought not to gawk at it, but it wasn't easy. "I passed my background check, and I had a personal reference from the Dean of Early Childhood Development at A&M Kingsville." She sounded like she was defending herself, and she hated that. Impressive. And he actually sounded impressed. "So you're from Kingsville, then?" "Del Rio." Her heel picked that moment to twist out from under her. Ugh! Thankfully, she caught her own balance this time, but it was a close save. These stupid shoes. Skeptically, he surveyed her feet. "They don't make walking look all that easy, or that safe." "Tell me about it." She continued walking, although he had slowed down in deference to her struggle. Shaking his head, he pressed his lips together in earnest concern. "Why don't you take them off? You're going to kill yourself on that last quarter up the hill." "Oh, yeah, like I'm going to walk into the Ayer mansion barefoot. That would make a really great first impression." Sarcasm dripped from her spirit. Who would even make such a dumb suggestion? He glanced behind them. "Well, nobody comes down this road but me. They ain't going to see you anyway, and besides, I'll warn you before we get too close." Maggie still wasn't so sure, but her ankles were starting to protest rather loudly. "Okay, fine." She reached down for one shoe, but had to scoot her other foot around to keep her balance. She reached out for something solid and met his arm coming the other way. Smooth skin under her palm ripped sanity away from her. How in the world had she gotten here? Sweat beaded out of her back, and she was quite sure it had nothing to do with the humidity. Quickly, she removed first one shoe and then the other. When they were off, and she was once again on solid footing, she had to admit it was a good idea, even if her breathing was no longer working properly. "You got it?" he asked, eyeing her seriously. "Yeah." She forced a knot of a smile on her face and started walking. The pavement would have been burning hot had it not been shadowed by the millions of leaves above them. Just then, a breeze swept through the branches and right over them. Ah! The sigh of relief was automatic. "So, you're an early childhood education major?" he asked as they made their way back up the road. It didn't take long to understand what he meant about the last quarter of a hill. If it was any steeper than this part, she was in trouble. "Yeah, I graduated in December. This is the first permanent thing I found." "Well, we're glad to have you. I'm sure Pete and Izzy will keep you on your toes." The question of how familiar he seemed in referring to the children traced through her, but before she could voice that thought, he looked at her, and that scattered her thoughts like the pieces of a shattering window. "So, are you up for the 24-hour thing? Most people hear that and go running for the exits." She shrugged, and it took a solid breath to beat the sadness in her chest down. "I like the idea of having a roof over my head, It's worth a little work to have that." He nodded, head down, concentrating on walking. When she looked over at him, she fought not to notice how rugged and tanned his face was. In fact, with that face and that body, he looked like he belonged nowhere else other than out in nature, taming some wild beast. His whiskers were more than a 5 o'clock shadow. They were a dark emphasis to the sheer masculinity of the rest of him. With a glance, he caught her looking at him and smiled. Lines of amusement appeared on either side of his face. "What?" "Oh, nothing." She ripped her gaze away from him. "I just hope I don't do anything to mess this up." When he looked at her again, the smile that was already beginning to get to her was soft and encouraging. "I think you'll be just fine." Chapter 2. "Schedules ought to be followed and not questioned," Inez said, with no small amount of seriousness. "I will have Patty Ann put a full schedule for the children's next week on the desk in your room." Patty Ann?" Maggie asked, wanting not to miss even the smallest detail. "Mrs. Ayer's personal secretary. She handles all of Mrs. Ayer's personal affairs, including children issues." Children issues? They sounded like line items on a checklist. "For tonight's purposes, baths are at 7:30 sharp. Bedtime is 8. It would be best if you stayed in your room or at least in the children's wing during your time here. I do not recommend going anywhere else other than down these stairs to the kitchen or the entryway stairs to the outside if need be. The last nanny was fired for being where she wasn't supposed to be." Fear pounced on her, but she yanked it back. "Oh, that shouldn't be a problem." "Good. Well, unless there are any questions, it's time for me to start dinner." The United States Navy couldn't have sounded any more regimented. "I think I'll be fine." Like a drill sergeant, Inez turned on her heel and started down the stairs that led right into the kitchen. With a sigh of exasperated relief, Maggie turned the other direction. Welcome to the life of the rich and famous. She went into the playroom. Peter was now sitting quietly on the floor playing with the blocks. Isabella was lying on the little couch sucking her thumb. Big brown eyes stared at Maggie, wary but hopeful. "Ah, sweetie girl, are you tired?" Maggie walked over and picked her up, soft pink ruffled dress and all. "What do you say we sit here in the chair and read a book? How would that be?" She carried the child to the wooden rocking chair and sat down. Reaching to the side, she pulled up the first book she came to, Sleeping Beauty. With the barest of pushes of her toe, she started the chair rocking gently. Isabella tucked her head closer to Maggie, who wrapped her spirit around the baby in her lap. Once upon a time. Calling Dallas wasn't all that unusual for Keith. In fact, he usually found some excuse to bridge the gap between them at least 3 or 4 times during the week. So why placing that call on Thursday night felt so strange? He couldn't exactly tell. She would be back home in a couple of weeks, and in truth, he was looking forward to seeing her again. When her phone clicked, he smiled as he always did when they stole a few minutes away from life to be together. He settled deeper into the soft cream couch. "Hey, babe, how's it going?" Dinner had been interesting. Baths weren't much better. Not because the children were bad or hard to manage. Much the opposite. As Maggie sat on her massive, preternaturally high 4-poster queen bed, she leaned her head first one way, then the other, to work out the kinks. It wasn't something she could put into actual words. But both children did not seem so much children as miniature adults. They were quiet. Very quiet. Especially Peter. He seemed so circumspect about every move he made, like when they entered the formal dining room and he had walked first to his mother to give her a kiss on the cheek, and then to his father, whom he shook hands with. It was like watching someone meet the Queen. Isabella was more demonstrative, but measurably so. Maggie wrapped her arms around her knees as she thought about holding the little girl while they rocked, read, and then took a nap together. Here there was no yelling, no danger of physical harm, and yet there was no joy either. Even at Mrs. Malinowski's, there were always ropes to jump and games to play. Here, games seemed to be relegated to Peter being one-on-one with a few blocks in the corner. Maggie shook her head and pursed her lips together. Pulling the heavy, deep red comforter, dotted with thousands of tiny white flowers entwined with green vine, from her legs, she slid off the bed and onto her knees. The plush cream carpeting felt like clouds. Propping her hands on the edge of the bed, she bent her head and let the words in her heart become wings of prayer. Dear Lord, I know these kids have everything except what they really need. Please give me the strength and the wisdom to bring your joy and love into their lives. Bind Satan from this house and let him not get a foothold here. Cast him out into the darkness and fill this house with your light, your love, your grace, and your peace. Amen. Oh, and keep Mrs. Mal and all her kids safe for me. Rain your saving love into the hearts of every child who is alone, afraid, or in need tonight. I ask all these things in your name. Amen. When she stood, she considered getting into bed, but thought better of it. Instead, she padded quietly to the door. She cracked it open and checked both ways. Slipping into the hallway, she tiptoed to the door next to hers, Isabella's. As it had the first time, the sheer size of the room brought a shake of her head. She walked silently to the baby bed wrapped in big, pink ruffles and peered over the side. Peaceful and soft, Isabella lay, sucking her thumb, eyes closed and cooing softly. Good night, little one. God bless you. Maggie laid her hand on the little curls and said a quick prayer. Then she turned and tiptoed out into the nightlight-illuminated hallway and to the room across the way. In the junior bed, with ball and bat wallpaper ringing the room around him, lay Peter. He seemed at first to be sleeping, but then she noticed his little eyes twitching ever so slightly. Puzzled, she bent closer to him and watched carefully. It took several seconds, but his eyes became slits. Peter, she said softly, in case he really was asleep. At that, he came full awake. Hey, sweetheart, you're not asleep yet? Solemnly, he shook his head, his soft brown eyes pleading with her not to be mad. She smiled gently. Tell you what, why don't we say our prayers together? Maybe that will help. Kneeling next to his bed, she took hold of his little hand and closed her eyes. Dear Jesus, be with Peter tonight. Give him peace. Help him to fall asleep. Send your saints and angels to guard him through the night until the dawning of the morning light. This we ask in your name. Amen. A grateful smile traced through Peter's eyes and across his face. Better? She asked, gazing at him seriously. Up and down went the little head. Good. She pulled the covers around him and tucked them in. When she stood, she ran her hand over his blonde hair. Now, you get some sleep and let Jesus take care of everything else, 'kay? 'Kay. I'm right down the hall if you need anything. He nodded, his eyes already starting to look heavy and laden with sleep. Good night, sweet prince, she said, and with one more brush of his hair, she left him to his dreams. As stupid as it sounded, Keith wondered the next day how Maggie was getting by. He checked on her car on his way to work, and it was indeed still in the barn. Impressive crossed his mind. Of course, it couldn't last. Vivian was impossible with the help, and his father was more apt to fire than to listen. Trying to dismiss her from his thoughts, Keith entered the stables and strode to the office in the back. Mornin'. Ike Jones, the trainer, looked up and his face fell in concern. "You're up early. You feeling okay?" "I'm fine. I just figured if we've only got till May to get Dragnet going, we'd better get to work." "Hodges called about the feed," Ike said. "It should be here tomorrow. Something about hauling eggs upstate." "We got enough to cover it?" "Yeah, but we need to keep a watch on them. They did this last-minute thing to us 2 months ago. I don't want to make a habit out of cutting it this close." "Got it." Keith yanked on his work gloves. "Did you get that fence fixed yesterday?" "Fence?" Ike asked incredulously. "I've been buried here under this mountain of paperwork for a week. What do you think?" Keith smiled with a slight tease on the edges. "I'll let you worry about the paperwork. Leave the real work to me." "Ha ha." But Ike didn't really protest. "Don't hurt yourself getting your head through the door." This time, Keith laughed outright. "No worries there. That's why they made the barn door so wide." Ike, too, joined in the laughter. Then his gaze fell to the desk. "Oh, and sometime today, you need to take these invoices up to the main house. Your dad needs them for the accountants." "Invoices? Be still my beating heart." "Yeah, yours or mine," Ike said with more seriousness this time. "And with all due respect, I'd rather it be yours." Keith yanked the nail bags from the side wall. "Such loyalty. You won't take a bullet for me?" "A bullet, yes. Your father, on the other hand?" With a shake of his head, Keith attached the belt to his waist. "You're the definition of bravery, Ike." "Bravery around here gets people killed or fired, neither of which I really need right now." Keith started toward the door and was halfway out of it when Ike yelled, "Hey, invoices." Some excitement in life just couldn't be avoided. He stepped back to the trainer's desk and took the stack of papers. "Okay, but if I don't come back, it's your fault." "Better my fault than my head," and Keith ducked out. His father was bad. There was no doubt about it. Everyone knew it, and they all lived a life in barely disguised fear. But really, he wasn't all that bad. At least he hadn't been when Keith's mother was still alive. The sadness that always accompanied thoughts of her drifted over him. Pushing it back, he loaded the tools he needed into the bright red Dodge extended cab and climbed in. That was the one lesson he had learned with precision from his father, the great therapeutic benefits of good old-fashioned hard work. It had taken her most of the morning to find it, but with careful examination, Maggie had indeed carved out 1 whole hour in which nothing else was planned for the children. In the morning, it was dance class for Isabella and art for Peter. Then lunch in the breakfast nook. Even that detail was noted in the schedule. In fact, everything was noted down to the minute, including the 10 minutes of walking in the garden from 1 o'clock to 10 after. However, after the walk, and before nap time, which was also clearly spelled out, there it was, a whole blessed hour with not one thing scheduled. She had seen the enormous redwood playhouse in the backyard from the window in the playroom. Bending down to their level, she let her eyes go wide. "What do you say, before nap time, we go out in the playhouse and read some stories?"
"Stories!"
Isabella squealed excitedly. "Shh!" Peter immediately warned, and the fear was evident. "No, it's okay, Peter," Maggie said, taking his hand. "Isabella's just happy. Aren't you happy?"
"I don't want to go."
Sullen and afraid, he looked like a trapped animal. "Really? Why not?" His gaze dropped to the carpet.
"I don't want to get dirty. We'll get dirty if we go outside."
Oh. She sounded like she understood, although she really didn't. "Well, I'll tell you what. We'll find some clothes that we don't have to worry about a little dirt. How would that be?" Peter still didn't look convinced, but Maggie started about finding the clothes despite his reluctance. It took 15 minutes of their precious hour, but she got them ready, and with Isabella in one arm and Peter's hand tucked securely in her other hand, they went out to the playhouse in the backyard. Crud. The invoices still lay on the seat. Really and truly, Keith didn't have time for this, but he knew it was time that had to be made. Turning the pickup up the side road, he bypassed the stables and headed to the main house. Jeffrey was out front mowing, and Keith waved at him with a lift of his hand. "Just get this done and get back to work." He climbed the front steps 2 at a time and entered without announcing his presence. Everything was quiet, not a sound anywhere. He wondered for a moment where Maggie and the kids were. Probably at some lesson of some kind. There was never a shortage of lessons with Vivian at the helm. Quietly, he made his way down to his father's office at the end of the hallway. He was 1 second from knocking when he heard the voices from beyond the door, which was open a fraction of an inch. It took him a minute of listening to decide who was in there and whether or not he should knock. By the time he decided, knocking was obviously less than prudent. "I can't believe you didn't notice this on her records," his father said. "That's not inconsequential, you know." "I know, Conrad. Believe me, I know. If I would have noticed it, I would never have even called her in the first place. But you know how desperate I've been for someone. I thought Alicia was the answer, but then she quit before she ever showed up. This was the only application I had left." "You should know better, Viv. We can't have just anybody coming in this house. There are records and information, not to mention the money and the jewelry. Someone with her background? You just never know. How can we trust someone like that?"
"I get it, Conrad. Really, I do. But we're leaving Monday. We've had this cruise scheduled for 6 months. If I fire her now, there's no way I'll have someone else by then. I don't want to miss this trip. We haven't been anywhere, just the 2 of us, since Izzy was born."
"I don't know. Leaving her here for a whole week with no one to look after the place. I don't like the sound of that." As if he hadn't been standing there for 5 minutes, Keith knocked on the door. "Dad?" He pushed the door open, and his father and Vivian both looked up like they had been caught. "Oh, sorry, Vivian. I didn't realize you were here." He held up the receipts. "I just needed to drop these off." Nonchalantly, he stepped into the room and handed the receipts over to his father. Then he turned to go, but stopped. "Oh, we're keeping an eye on Hodges. They've been jerking us around on the feed supply, just so you know." "Okay." Keith could feel the intense conversation going on between the 2 of them without hearing any of it. "Well, that's it. I'll just get—" "You know, Keith." His father stood, still looking at Vivian. Finally, he put his full gaze on his son. "We're going on vacation come Monday, and we're needing someone to keep watch over things here while we're gone." "Oh, sure thing," he nodded. "I'll make sure everything stays on an even keel, just like always." Once again, he turned for the door, and this time he had his hand actually on the knob. No," his father said, stopping him. "I don't think you understand." When Keith turned, his father was looking at Vivian, obviously trying to get her to give up the crazy idea. Finally, his father relented and stepped around the desk. "We want you to stay up here in the main house and keep an eye on Peter and Isabella." "Pete and Izzy? Isn't that why you hired Maggie?" "Well, yes." The battle to figure out a plausible lie was clear. "But she doesn't even know her way around yet. I'd hate to dump all of this on her and take off." Keith considered this a moment and then shrugged. "Well, I don't mind if you don't." Anger flashed to the surface of his father's demeanor. "Of course I don't mind. What's that supposed to mean?" "It was a joke, Dad. You know, a joke. Ha ha." But no one was laughing. Vivian turned to him. "But you'll do it then?" Again, Keith shrugged. "What the heck, sure."
Careful down, careful down." Maggie stood at the foot of the ladder that stretched up into the playhouse above. Reading was fun, but their hour was gone. She was going to have to hurry to get them down for naps. Already, Isabella was huddled into Maggie's shoulder, sucking her thumb. Helping Peter down the last 2 steps, Maggie took his hand, and they started for the house. That house had a way of getting bigger every time she looked at it. She wondered how many rooms there actually were. Many more than she would ever be privy to visiting, she was sure. She pushed those thoughts to the back of her mind and stepped up to the door, which she opened and held for Peter. "Come on, we'd better get your sister down for her nap." They crossed through the living room and were 2 steps into the entryway when from the other hallway the hired hand, who seemed to be following her around, met them at the stairs. "Well, hey there," he said, and his easy smile was never far behind. "Hi." She could feel her glasses sliding down on her nose, but she didn't have enough hands to push them back up. He stepped over to her and ran his hand down Isabella's back. "Tired little girl."
"We went in the playhouse,"
Peter said at Maggie's knee, and she looked down at him in surprise. The hired hand sat down on his heel so he was on Peter's level. "I bet that was lots of fun. You being a good boy for Maggie?" Peter nodded, and Maggie fought not to notice the strength in the hand the guy reached out to ruffle Peter's hair. "Good deal. Keep it up, sport." Noise from down the hallway brought him to his feet, and Maggie's attention snapped that direction. Side by side, Mr. and Mrs. Ayer walked in. "Oh, Maggie, good. I'm glad we caught you," Mrs. Ayer said. As Maggie turned to them, she felt Peter cowering behind her knee. Balance was a challenge, what with Isabella now breathing softly on her chest and Peter's arm wrapped around her leg. However, she anchored herself to the floor to keep from being buffeted by the 2 little ones. "We are going out of town next week," Mrs. Ayer said, "and we've asked Keith to keep an eye on the place." For a split second, Maggie had the name with a question mark after it on her tongue, but before she could ask, the hired hand smiled at her. Her brain surged into gear. Oh. She fought to smile as 6,000 different emotions cracked over her. Great. "I promise I won't be too much of a pain," he said, and when he smiled at her, she couldn't stop her own from coming for real. Her gaze fell to the side. When she brought it up again, it was to look at Mrs. Ayer. "Just give Patty Ann the schedule you want for the kids. I'm sure we'll be fine." She wanted to say more. Her heart was jumping all over until in the swirl of emotions, she thought she might do something really stupid. "Well, I'd better get these 2 upstairs for their nap. We're late." Turning for the stairs carefully, she took hold of Peter's hand. "Come on, Peter. You can help me put baby Bella down." Keith couldn't help but watch the 3 of them all the way up the stairs. She was such a natural with the kids, not demanding or overbearing like the last 3 nannies they'd suffered through. No, Maggie had a genuine caring in her eyes. It was clear this wasn't just a job for her. Depression tamped down over his heart when he remembered it couldn't last. Certainly not with her less than perfect clothes and manner, and definitely not now that they had found whatever they'd found in her background. He wondered about that as she disappeared around the curve of the staircase to the level above. "Well, then it's settled," his father said, dragging Keith's attention back to reality. "We leave for Miami Monday morning, and we'll be back, when?" "The next Tuesday," Vivian said as she folded her arms across her chest. She stared up the stairs. "I hate to leave her alone like this." "Don't worry about it, Viv," Keith said confidently. "I've got it covered." Chapter 3. "Ms. Montgomery," Patty Ann, the prim, middle-aged lady with a stern face and the voice of stone, said, stopping Maggie 10 steps from the dining room that evening. Children dangled from her hip in her hand. "Oh, Yes, ma'am?
You're late, Ms. Montgomery.
Late? Maggie pulled Peter's hand up with her watch. It's 2 minutes till.
Yes, dinner is at 6. Arrival is prior to that, so that dinner can be served promptly on time. You must understand, Mrs. Ayer is very particular about the timing of the day, and Mr. Ayer is a very busy man.
Maggie fought the urge to curtsy. Yes, ma'am, I understand. I'm sorry. It won't happen again. There was disapproval all the way down to the tip of the long nose.
Make sure it doesn't.
That night, Maggie put the kids to bed right on schedule, then went to her own room to get herself ready for bed. However, before she could completely settle down for the night, she made one last little pilgrimage back to their rooms to check on them. It was a ritual she could get used to. Isabella was asleep, and Peter was waiting. "You're supposed to be asleep, little prince," she said as she knelt next to his bed. He rubbed his eye with a pudgy hand.
But we didn't say our prayers yet.
His simple trust drilled through her heart. "Okay, then we'd better get crackin', huh?" He closed his eyes, and she bent her head over his hand clasped in her too. "Dear Jesus, please be with us tonight. Keep us safe and give us good rest so we can have a great day tomorrow. Amen."
Amen.
There was no stopping the bright smile he beamed at her.
Night, Maggie.
"Good night, sweet prince." She stood and ran her hand over his hair, gazing at him for one more moment. With a sigh, she turned for the door. Quietly, she let herself out of the room and slipped back across the hallway. At her own bed, she knelt down and let her head fall forward as her eyes fell closed. "God, I know today's Sunday. I'm sorry I missed church. I just don't think right now asking for time off is such a good idea. Maybe next week, when they're gone." Anxiety pinged into her heart, but she breathed it down. "Please be with us this week. Be with the kids and be with me. Thank you, Father, for every good thing in our lives. Keep all the children in your embrace. Hold them and wipe all tears from their eyes. Amen." After she climbed in the bed and shut off the light, Maggie sank into the soft cotton sheets. When she closed her eyes, his smile drifted through her thoughts. Him. Keith. It wasn't fair to a girl's heart for a guy to look that good. Frustrated with herself, she flipped over the other way. "Stop it, Maggie. Stay focused on what's important here." However, no lecture in the world could keep him from her dreams. 4 days, and she was out of everything. Blouses, pants, dresses, even underwear. Monday morning, Maggie stood in her room looking into her empty suitcase, wishing she had thought to ask Inez where to wash things. Great. This is just wonderful. She pushed her hair out of her face, bent, and picked up the blouse she had worn the day before. Well, at least they're gone. Maybe I won't get crucified this time. Dressing quickly, lest she let her spirit dive too far, her thoughts went to today and all the terror it held. God, I'm asking here. Help me out, okay? I can't make an idiot of myself when he's around. Please. Keith waited until 8 o'clock to make his way up to the house. It wasn't that he wanted to wait, but it was safer. This way his father and Vivian would be long gone, and the only 2 she-wolves he would have to contend with were Inez and Patty Ann. They were bad enough to make him question his sanity in going. Nonetheless, the chance that he might get to see Maggie if he stopped in pulled courage into him. He went in the front door without knocking nor ringing the bell. Down the hallway, he could hear voices in the kitchen, and he angled his steps that direction. As he broke into the sunshine streaming into the breakfast nook, his heart swelled. He was glad he'd come. "Good morning." Isabella took one look up and slung her arms out toward him.
Keith!
"Hey, Izzy. Well, look how cute you are with this Cheerio stuck to your chin." He reached down and wiped it away with his thumb.
Normally, he wouldn't have had the guts to pick her up out of the high chair. But today, things were different. Today, only Maggie was here, and in his heart, he knew she wouldn't mind. Carefully, he slid the tray forward and pulled Izzy up into his arms. Like the angel she was, she wrapped her little arms all the way around his neck. He squeezed her, closing his eyes to breathe in her love. When the hug broke, he pulled back to look at her. "You are the cutest little thing I've ever seen." He put her back into the high chair and slid the tray back into place. Turning to Peter, he put a hand in the air. "And you, my man, what are you up to this morning?"
I petted the cat yesterday.
Surprise jumped through Keith. "No kidding. Wow, that's awesome." Then his gaze settled where it had wanted to since he had first taken in the scene. She had a way of looking unkempt and completely beautiful at the same time. The clip in her hair only held half of it, and the other half was streaming down around her head and shoulders, shining in the sunlight at her back. "Morning, Maggie." "Morning." She seemed to shrink back into the window seat where she sat. Inez went into town for groceries. I haven't seen Patty Ann yet. I think Jeffrey is supposed to be working on the front flower beds, but I haven't seen him yet either." "Oh, cool." Keith took a handful of Cheerios from the box and tossed them in his mouth. "You got lots planned today?" Trepidation trounced across her features. "Piano for Peter and baby and mom gymnastics for Iz." "Baby and mom? Isn't that going to be a little hard considering mom is in Miami?" He sat down in one of the chairs between Peter and Isabella. Leaning back, he watched Maggie intently. "Well, I guess I'm kind of filling in." That was one way of putting it. He took another handful of Cheerios. "So you get all settled in and everything?" She nodded. "I think I'm good." "Good deal. Glad to hear it." On his belt, his small cell phone beeped. In one motion, he pulled it up and turned it on. "This is Keith." Maggie had the distinct impression she was going to suffocate. His presence seemed to fill the whole room. He was talking on the phone, somebody named Ike, although she was trying not to listen. When he beeped the phone off, he stood. "Time to get to work." "Oh." She looked up and had to readjust her glasses, which she was sure were cockeyed. "Well, don't worry about us. We'll be fine." His gaze narrowed on her, and concern slammed into her. "Tell you what," he said. He turned for the kitchen, rummaged through one drawer, and came back with a pencil and a piece of paper. "Here's my number. If you need anything, you let me know." "Oh." Surprised, she fought to recover enough sanity to sound semi-intelligent. "Okay." He handed it over to her with that smile, and her head spun on the lack of air. "Thanks." "No problem." On his heel, he turned back for the kids. "Give me 5, slugger." Peter did as instructed. Keith stepped over to Isabella. "You be a good girl for Maggie, hear me?"
Keith!
Isabella squealed. "Yeah, Keith." He laughed and ruffled her hair. "Well, take it easy. I'll be back for dinner tonight unless I hear from you before that." "We'll be fine," Maggie said, willing her voice not to crack. "Good to know. See ya." "Yeah," she said when he was gone. "See ya." "Ugh, must you wear that dirty thing in the mansion?" Patty Ann asked as Keith got to the front door. Getting away that easy was too good to be true. He knew it, and yet he had hoped. Slowly he turned, his hand still on the doorknob. "You have a problem with my hat?" "Yes, I have a problem with it." She looked like a withered principal about to pronounce punishment on him. "Dirt has no place in the mansion." Keith shook his head without really shaking it. Now, Patty Ann, there's no need to get personal." The tailored black suit, the haughty, condescending face, the click of her tongue to emphasize her disapproval of him, They all added up to one thing in Keith: resolve not to hear another thing from her. "Mr. Ayer," she said with all the self-importance of a dictator. Keith held up his hand. "Wait. Stop. Right there." He waited a beat to make sure she had stopped. Then he wound his finger as if rewinding a tape. "Say that part again." Her eyes narrowed into little slits. "What part?" "You know, the part about Mr. Ayer." The arrow went right through her puffed-up pride. "Yeah, uh-huh." He had lived life for 5 years under her shoe, but that was then, and then was gone. "Let's get one thing straight, shall we? I am not someone you can boss around just because you think you own this place. You don't. If it were up to me, your bags would already be packed and on that front step, or better yet, in the driveway. Now, you may think you can run my father and Vivian, and maybe you do, but you do not run me. So, while I'm here, while I'm in charge, I think it's in your best interest to lay low and stay as far out of sight as possible." His thoughts traveled down the hallway to an innocent bystander who was about to get run over. "And let me make this very clear. You are not to go near Maggie or the kids this week. They are off limits." "Mr. Ayer, no." The stone hardness of the word slammed her protest into a brick wall and smashed it into 1,000 pieces. "I'm watching, and I'm listening, and if you so much as breathe on them wrong, you will be toast the minute Dad and Vivian step back through this door." He let those words sink in. "Are we clear on that?" It took her an eternity of seconds, but finally, angrily, she nodded. "Good." He reached up and tipped his hat. "Then have a nice day, Patty Ann." Somehow Maggie made it through the rest of the day without thinking about him too much. At least, that's what she would have told anyone who had asked. The truth was, every sound she heard in the house brought the anxious excitement that had come to punctuate every encounter she'd had with him. At 6 o'clock sharp, she set the children in the formal dining room, napkins and 3 forks all in place. Inez stepped in. "Do you want to go ahead, or should we wait, ma'am?" Ma'am. The word cracked Maggie backward. "I think we'll just go ahead. He might have decided not to come, after all." When Inez nodded and turned back for the kitchen, Maggie wondered which would be worse, if he didn't show up, or if he did. They had made it through the day with no mishap major enough to warrant hailing him on the cell phone. That was a good thing. At least he wouldn't think she was completely incompetent. Sorry. I didn't realize it was so late." Keith made his entrance without really making it. One minute he wasn't there, the next minute he was.
Keith!
Isabella said excitedly. "Hey, baby girl." He took the seat across from Maggie, right next to Peter. Inez followed him in, holding the serving platter. She set it on the table. "It looks wonderful," Keith said. "Will there be anything else?" "Looks great." Inez bowed and walked out. "Well," Keith breathed the word as if he had been running a marathon right up to the moment he sat down. He reached for the serving spoon, and Maggie gasped softly. His gaze jumped to her. "What?" She fought with her emotions to get a smile on her face. "Shouldn't we say grace first?" "Oh, of course." His hand fell back to his lap, and he bent his head obediently. "Father, bless his food and all those gathered here. Please keep Peter and Isabella's mommy and daddy safe on their trip, and let them come back soon. Amen." Amen. His gaze slid up to hers, and she couldn't read what was written there. In the next breath, he was serving everyone as Maggie passed him Isabella's plate, and then worked to cut up the food for Isabella. She did her level best not to stare at him. He looked wholly out of place in this room. Somehow the chandelier and the bandana didn't scream complimentary. As they ate, She kept her gaze on her plate, or helped Isabella. "So how was piano?" Keith finally asked Peter.
Hard.
"Yeah, well, nothing worthwhile is easy." Once again, Maggie marveled at his easy way with the kids. He didn't seem intimidated nor apprehensive around them at all. "How was work?" Maggie asked him, just so there was something more than silence in the room. The question took him off guard. "Oh, well, it was good. Ike thinks Cumane has a great chance at Grand Prairie this weekend." "Cumane?" She needed more information to formulate a response. "Our best thoroughbred. Ike and Tanner are heading out Wednesday morning."
To Grand Prairie?
"Yeah, it's not too bad, just upstate."
"And you're not going?"
The smile only lifted halfway. "No, I'm babysitting, remember?" The reply rumbled over her, and Maggie dropped her gaze.
"We'd be fine, really. We hate to keep you."
He shook his head, and his smile was full now. "Nah, I was kidding. I only go to the big ones anyway. Too much work to get done around here to be off partying at the races."
Housies,
Isabella said, and a light went on behind Keith's eyes.
"That's right. Horses, good girl."
He started to take a bite, and then let the fork drop down.
"Hey, you guys haven't been out to the stables in a while. Why don't you come out tomorrow? I could come get you after lunch if you want." The no jumped into Maggie's consciousness.
"Oh, I don't."
really?
Peter's eyes widened to saucer size. Then he seemed to remember where he was, and his gaze slid to Maggie's just before it fell to the table.
No, we better not.
That pushed Keith backward in his chair. A concerned scowl dropped across his features. "Why not? You love the horses." Peter never lifted his gaze.
We might get dirty.
Disappointment slid over Keith's features. "Oh." Maggie heard the hurt in that single syllable. She knew it was taking her life in her hands, but nobody would ever know anyway.
"Well, I think it sounds like lots of fun. We'll put it on the schedule and call it a field trip."
The smile was back. She was beginning to love that smile. Keith made sure to call Dallas from the main house that night. It was good to hear her voice, to hear about her day, to hear about how things were going with the law clerking she was doing. It sounded so perfectly Dallas. He was happy for her. When he hung up, his thoughts traveled through the house to the other side, the kids' wing. He considered going over to make sure everything was all right, but sanity stopped him from doing that. She would think he was checking up on her, and he didn't want that. Besides, he needed sleep. Tomorrow was a big day. They were coming to the stables. Maggie was crazy enough to try this little diversion, but she hadn't completely lost her mind. "Car seats," she said as she stood on the mansion's top step overlooking the driveway, 2 car seats flanking her stance. As always, Isabella was snuggled in her arms, and Peter was hovering not too far away. "Can't be too safe." Keith yanked the 2 seats from the top step and descended as if he was carrying a glass of water rather than 2 awkward, heavy objects. Maggie followed him to the pickup and waited while he fought to get the first seat in and secure. When Isabella's was ready, Maggie stepped forward and settled her in. From the other side of the pickup, Keith opened the driver door and then the back. Once again, he went to work getting the second seat in place and ready. "You didn't know it was going to take an act of Congress, huh?" Maggie asked, teasing him. "Nah, it's just a bill," he replied. She laughed as he lifted Peter into the seat. A click, and Keith slammed the door. She followed suit before climbing in front. "So, how far is this anyway?" "1.5 miles. We'll be there before you know it." For as dusty and dirty as Keith always was, the pickup was remarkably clean. In fact, the dark gray seats looked as if they could have just rolled off the lot. The air conditioner was on, not hard and high, but light and gentle. On the stereo, George Strait sang a waltz, and Maggie glanced at the readout which showed track 9. Not just some country station, he had the CD. That must mean he listened to straight. That was a good sign. He had good taste. They skirted the main gate and went down a side road practically hidden in the crush of trees. Up a hill and down another stretch of road, and then a full racetrack came into view. Wow! When you said racing, I had no idea. If you're going to do it, you might as well do it right, Keith said with a glance at her. I guess so. At the track, they turned to the left, down another little road until they stopped at the barn.
Do we get to ride too?
Peter asked from the back. You still remember how, don't you? Keith got out and Maggie followed his lead.
Yes.
Cool, then we get to ride. Keith had purposely forgotten to tell Ike about this little outing. It wasn't that Ike would be mad. On the contrary, he was forever hinting at his concern for the kids with little offhanded comments. Still, something in Keith didn't want to tip Ike off about things that weren't happening anyway. It was better that way. Hey, Keith said, ducking into the trainer's office. We're going to take Buck and Nell out for a spin, just so you know. However, Ike's glance up snagged on Peter standing at Keith's knee. Oh, Peter. Well, well, look at you. Aren't you getting to be the big boy? Great. There was no going back now. Ike stood and strode to the door. His sharply pressed jeans made their customary swishing sound. Those things must stand up in the corner by themselves. Unfortunately, Ike's approach pushed Keith back into the barn's breezeway where Maggie stood, holding Isabella. The second Ike stepped out of the office, nervous awkwardness snaked through Keith. Oh, well, who do we have here? Ike asked. Maggie Montgomery. She held out her hand, which Ike took like the true gentleman he was. I'm the new nanny. Well, Miss Montgomery, may I say you are a welcome addition to the outfit. Thank you, she said, and ducked with half a step back. Like I said, Keith whacked a hand into Ike's chest. We're going to take Buck and Nell out for a while. The glint in Ike's eyes told him he would never hear the end of this one. Okay, but don't get lost. One ride on a pony at the county fair when she was 5 didn't exactly give Maggie immense experience in the art of horseback riding. However, Isabella couldn't ride by herself. So, praying like she had never prayed before, she mounted the reddish mare that Keith swore was the tamest on the place. Once she was on, Keith handed her Isabella. It took a little effort to get her situated between the saddle horn and Maggie, but when she was finally there, she felt made for that space. Got it? Keith asked, gazing up at her from his stance on the ground. Yeah, we're good. Cool. Now for you, little man. With seemingly no effort at all, Keith swung Peter onto the other mount, a gray speckled but otherwise dirty beige-colored horse. There was no pause as Keith mounted behind Peter. We set? Set, Maggie affirmed. Keith turned his horse down onto the little trail, and with a deep breath, Maggie followed. The horses took a steady but slow pace as they passed through a knot of trees that Maggie had to duck underneath. There was a short span that the trees gave them breathing room, one more set of extra close ones, and then they broke out onto the open plain beyond. Oh, wow, Maggie gasped before she could stop herself. He looked over his shoulder. Nice, huh? It's beautiful. The field, stretching to the horizon, was awash in blue bonnets and orange paintbrushes. Spring had definitely arrived. A cool breeze brushed through her hair, sending it streaming behind her. It felt so good in so many ways, she couldn't catalog them all. The breeze was great, the day was beautiful, the landscape was perfect. Even the movement of the red mare was lulling and rhythmic. Staying right here forever sounded like the best idea she had ever heard. How far they went, she didn't know, but suddenly she became aware of the heaviness of the child in front of her. Not wanting to bother Keith with slowing down, Maggie twisted her head around until she could see that yes, in fact, Isabella was asleep. She didn't blame the little girl. Had she not known she was on an animal that could be unpredictable, she too would have fallen asleep. This was more perfection than anyone should have the right to enjoy. Her thoughts drifted to the kids at Mrs. Malinowski's. They had no idea these kinds of places even existed. They had no idea of the possibilities in life. She wondered if she had ever known the possibilities in this life until this very afternoon. Determination to do something to show them drifted into her spirit. Some day, when she wasn't worried about how to pay for tomorrow, she would step into Mrs. Malinowski's shoes and do for others what that woman in her faith had done for her. "How you doing?" Keith asked from ahead of her. "Great." He spun slightly in his saddle to look at her. "Oh, she's out." "Yeah, she didn't last long." "Maybe we should go back." "No, it's okay." Maggie shook her head, feeling the hair dance in the freedom of the breeze. "Let's keep going a little longer. We can be a little late for nap time." Chapter 4. There was no question by the time dinner was finished that she was going to be sore tomorrow. Maggie stood from the table and swallowed the groan of pain that attacked her. Keith looked up from his spot by Peter. "So, how was riding?"
Fun.
Peter said before Maggie had the chance.
Hussies.
Isabella said as Maggie took her plate and set it to the side. "You, little missy, need a good scrubbing." Maggie picked the little girl up out of the high chair, the evidence of the mashed potatoes smeared all across her face. "Goodness, you even smell like those Hosies."
Hussies.
Isabella said again, swinging her little feet into Maggie's thigh. "Maybe some other time. Right now, it's bath time." Without being told, Peter stood from his place, stacked his silverware on his plate, and took it to the kitchen. Maggie sighed in spite of herself. He was much too old for 4. "Well, we'll see you in the morning." "Yeah. Have a good night." "We will." She took Peter's hand. "Come on, Buster. I'll let you play with the Ernie boat." It was stupid. Keith knew it. But the quieter the house got, the more he wanted to check just one time. They were already in bed, probably asleep, and yet he wanted to make sure of that. Finally, unable to talk himself out of it, he quietly exited his room on the far opposite side of the mansion. He shook his head as he crossed past the master suite. How very far it seemed from the kids' rooms. Not for the first time ever, he wondered why they bothered to have Pete and Izzy in the first place. Little trophies. That's all they had ever really been. It was just like Ike said, kids were meant to live with their parents, not be put on display to make the parents look good. Shaking his head to clear it of the disturbing thoughts, Keith made his way to the 3 doors at the far end of the hall. He noticed, without really looking, that the light was on under her door. She was probably reading or getting ready for bed. He'd have to be extra quiet. On his way to Isabella's door, however, he noticed the white door on the opposite side cracked open. That was strange. Curious, he stepped over to it and peeked inside. The scene beyond knocked sanity and air from him simultaneously. There on her knees, next to Peter's bed, knelt Maggie. He couldn't see her face, but her back was arched. She was huddled in the protectiveness of her shoulders. Next to her, Peter lay, eyes closed, but turned toward her.
And help Mommy and Daddy come home safely. Thank you for today, God. Give us good sleep tonight, and let us have a great day tomorrow. Amen.
Unbidden tears sprang into Keith's heart as he watched. Amen. Peter's eyes opened and he smiled at Maggie. Just then he glanced up, and Keith knew he was busted. He sniffed self-consciously. In the next heartbeat, Maggie whirled around. Fear and determination met in her face right up until she figured out who he was standing there. She stumbled to her feet. "Keith, I didn't hear you there." The A-lined white cotton shirt set off her curves, as did the oversized tan pants. They were very loose and too short to be called pants. He was having trouble getting a full thought through his head. I'm sorry. I was just checking everything before I turned in." "Oh." Her hand slid to the back of her shirt, which she pulled down. Then she brought her hand back around her middle and scratched the inside of her other forearm. "Everything locked down tight?" "Seems to be." "Oh, good." If he hadn't been thrown so hard off track, he might have noticed how much trouble she was having to not fidget right off the planet. She wrapped her arms in front of her and scratched behind her ear. Her gaze fell to Peter. "Just—" Compassion for her came over him. "No, hey, no need to explain. I talk to him sometimes too." "Oh." She seemed rooted to the spot. "Well, I guess I should be getting to bed." Her smile became gentle as she glanced back at Peter. "You, mister, have a good night, okay? I'll see you in the morning."
Okay.
The quiet peace of the scene traced over Keith as he watched her tuck the covers in around Pete. She was going to be a marvelous mother someday. Good night, sweet prince. She kissed the tips of 2 of her fingers and pressed them onto Peter's forehead. "Now, go to sleep." Gently, she drifted her fingers over his face and down the sides of his nose. With a sigh, he settled down, and soft peace came over his little face. Maggie turned back to the door and walked all the way to it and through it without stopping. Keith let her pass and then closed the door and stood watching her in the hallway. That was nice. She had made it to her door, obviously not planning to stop and talk to him. Her gaze was down when she turned to him. "Peter has a tough time getting to sleep. It seems to help." Tenderness touched his heart. "So, you do that every night? Pray with him?" It took her a long moment before she nodded. "It always helps me, so I figured it couldn't hurt with him." True admiration for her tilted his head to the side. "They're lucky to have you." She tried to meet his gaze but couldn't hold it. "I wish I could do more. They're great kids." If he could have thought of something to say that would have kept her there, he would have said it. However, for some reason his brain wasn't cooperating with his mouth. "Well, night." She turned, opened her door, and stepped inside. "Yeah, night." And then she was gone. Keith closed his eyes and shook his head. Why she had this effect on him he couldn't clearly tell. This was completely crazy. He was, after all, engaged to be married. Engaged. That meant you weren't up at all hours of the night standing in darkened hallways with some woman in her pajamas. He needed to call Dallas, if for no other reason than to douse the guilt slashing its way through him. Okay, there are certain things in this life a girl just shouldn't have to deal with. Changing flat tires, for instance. Radiators overheating? Yes. A busted pipe? Programming the remote control? But being blindsided like that wasn't fair at all. When the door closed between them, Maggie forced herself to breathe in a deep inhale. It did nothing at all to stop the swimming of her thoughts or the racing of her heart. But at that point, anything was worth a try. Showing up in the kitchen at breakfast for no reason was one thing. Showing up when she was in her oldest pajamas with a rip on one side was quite another. Her hand went up to her hair and she raked her fingers through it extra hard. There was no telling how she looked. But how he looked. Wow! Was he easy on the eyes? Not to even mention how heart-stoppingly handsome he was minus the hat and the bandana. Dark hair cropped extra short, and that face and that smile. It just wasn't fair. She rolled her eyes so she was looking up at the ceiling in desperation. God,
Listen to me. I do not need to fall for this guy. I don't need him to keep showing up like this. Please, please, I'm asking you."
"Good morning," Keith said brightly the very next morning as he strode into the kitchen, bandana on and hat in hand. Apparently, her prayers all night long had had no effect. Maggie sighed in consternation and planted a patient smile on her face. "Morning. There's Cheerios." "Cool." He sat down between the two kids and grabbed the box and a bowl from the middle of the table. Maggie had been wondering why Inez had set an extra one out. Now she knew. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. "Good. You?" "I'm going to have to go get my own pillow from my place. These extra fluffy things are about to do me in." He leaned his head first one way, then the other. "Ike's heading out this morning?" she asked, pulling her shoulders up to her ears as wrists to elbows she straightened on the little window seat. 10. I've got to get over there as soon as I can. They're going to be wondering where I am." He ate a bite, then looked over at her, which did nothing to calm her stomach. "You don't eat breakfast?" "Oh, I had a muffin earlier." "A muffin?" He lifted his chin skeptically. "Well, that's one plus in your favor. Helga got canned because she ate too much." Maggie swallowed at the implication. "Helga?" "She was the nanny, a year and a half ago, something like that." If he was trying to make her feel better, it wasn't working. "So, they go through a lot of nannies, huh?" Keith shrugged as he finished off his Cheerios. "About one every couple months or so." "Oh." It was all she could get out. "Well, I'm off to the races." He stood and grabbed his hat from the table. When it was on his head, Maggie had to force herself to think. Then he smiled, and all the remaining thoughts scattered along with their counterparts. "Or to get 'em ready for the races, anyway. Y'all have a good day."
Bye, Keith,
Isabella said through her mouthful of food. "Bye, baby doll." Keith bent and kissed her forehead. "See ya, slugger." He waved at Peter, and with that he strode out of the kitchen. The air she hadn't realized she wasn't breathing escaped in a rush. He had to quit doing that. He was going to kill her before they had a chance to fire her. Keith felt bad about mentioning the nanny situation, but it was only fair to warn her. More to the point, every time he saw her, he had to remind himself that this couldn't last. She would be gone by the end of the month if she lasted that long. He had a life, his own life, and it did not include Maggie Montgomery. "So, you decided to grace us with your presence this morning?" Ike asked when Keith stalked into the barn. "I'm early." "And happy about it, I see." Ike was busy loading the horse equipment into the trailer. When he hopped from the trailer's running board, his cowboy boots kicked up a puff of dust. "You see Maggie this morning?" He didn't want to answer that question. It did funny things to his heart. "Yeah, she was at breakfast." The trainer's motion slowed to a stop, and he exhaled hard. "Listen, Keith, this is none of my business." Keith looked up at him and steeled himself. There was a challenge in his eyes and his voice. "But?" Ike shook his head slowly. "Look, I don't have to tell you the score. You know it better than I do. But a spring fling with someone who will almost surely be gone before anyone knows she's here is not worth risking what you have with Dallas. As good as it looks, as easy as it looks, it's not worth it." Anger and embarrassment cracked into Keith. "Come on, Ike. I'm not that stupid. Besides, you know that's not my style anymore. Maggie's a friend, and not even that." "Yeah, well," Ike stopped toe-to-toe with Keith, his faded gray eyes as serious as Keith had ever seen them. "Keep it that way, okay?" "Dallas, hey, how's it going?" Keith put his elbow over the soft tan couch cushion as he sat back that night. He was safe and secure, locked in his own bedroom, far across the mansion from the kids' wing.
Ugh. I'm about 2 seconds from cracking somebody's skull against a wall, Dallas said in typical Dallas fashion. Oh, why's that? What's it always, studying as usual? Her voice softened. It's good to hear your voice, though. I need some sanity. Now I'm sanity? He laughed. That's scary. Tell me about it. I'm so ready to get out of here I could scream. 2 weeks you'll be back here with me. No books, no studying. He closed his eyes and could almost catch the feeling of her being right there with him. Can I come now? His laugh was a breath. Afraid not. But I'll tell you what. You buckle down and stick with it, and when you get here, we'll throw you a big party. Ugh, don't remind me. What? You having second thoughts? No. The sigh was soft, barely there. But the planning and the parties and the crowds, can't we just elope? Oh, your dad would love that. Don't remind me. Mom called today. They're coming up for a visit. Well, it's actually for a fundraiser, but that's as close as I get to a real visit these days. The junior senator from Texas has higher ambitions? Keith asked, amused. Always. Him, me. It runs in the family. Well, I can't speak for him, but I am very proud of you. Thanks. I needed to hear that. She sighed, and he felt it run him through. I'm so ready to see you. Me too. Then he stopped himself. I can't wait to see you. I see myself every morning. You're crazy. Yeah, about you. They talked a while longer, and when he hung up, Keith felt better. Ike was right. Being around Maggie was playing with fire, and he didn't need that in his life. He had done that enough and had been burned repeatedly. No, in 4 days, his parents would be back. She would probably be gone for reasons he still didn't know. What he did know was that at some point things would go back to normal, and normal did not include Maggie Montgomery. Hanging on to that thought, he dug himself in the pillows and forced himself to stay there. By the next morning, Keith had come up with a solid plan. He wouldn't go anywhere near her unless absolutely necessary. For breakfast, he grabbed a Dr. Pepper out of Ike's stash in the barn. If all went well, he would have lunch at his place and call to let Inez know he was going to be late for dinner tonight. He could show up after they had gone to bed. It was a great plan. The fact that Keith hadn't been around didn't stop Maggie's heart from jumping every time there was a noise at a door. She had never felt so scattered or so flighty. The kids were great as usual. Through the soccer lesson and lunch, they were angels. For that, Maggie was grateful, because she was having a really hard time concentrating on anything other than when he might show up again. Trying to come up with anything that might stave off insanity, she had a thought after lunch. Hey, you two, what do you say we make smoothies and take them out to the playhouse?
What's a smoothie?
Peter asked. Come on, I'll show you. She took them both to the kitchen, knowing Inez had gone into town to do errands, and Patty Ann wasn't due back until at least 4. Careful to anchor her, Maggie set Isabella on the counter. With only 2 cabinet openings, she found the blender. From his spot on the floor, Peter watched her. Here. She stood him up on the chair. You watch your sister. Obediently, Peter put his hands on Isabella. Maggie went to the refrigerator and got out a few things. They wouldn't be the most elaborate smoothies in the world, but she didn't think the kids would care anyway. This is going to be fun. She plugged the blender in and put several ingredients in: the strawberry yogurt, the bananas, the raspberries, and ice. Oh, milk. In 5 steps, the refrigerator door was open in her hand. It was then that she heard the scream.
Izzy, no!
On one whirl, she was around, and her own scream joined Peter's. Izzy, no! The growl of the blender was cacophonous, like a jackhammer on concrete,
Crushing, crunching, screeching, the blender flung the pink concoction in every conceivable direction. Who was screaming what, Maggie had no idea. All she knew was that by the time she got the blender shut off, there were pink splotches all over the kids, all over her, and most distressingly, all over the kitchen. Pink was dripping down the white glass cabinets, off the white and navy curtains, and all over the grouted gray tile floor. Oh my, no! She put her head back to keep from crying. No, 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 no! Pulling Patience to her with all her strength, she looked at the two children. Isabella was in the throes of an all-out panic attack, and Peter was cowering away from her like he was about to be beaten. She fought back her own distress and took a breath to try to calm herself. Carefully, gently, Maggie took Isabella into her arms and sat down on the chair next to Peter, oblivious to the pink squish underneath her. It's okay, baby. I shouldn't have let you that close. In her arms, Maggie rocked the inconsolable child slowly until her wails became whimpers. My fault. That was all my fault. Peter's sniff behind her brought her attention to him, and with tears crowding her own eyes, Maggie reached back for him. It's okay, Peter. It's okay. Her tenderness wrenched sobs of fear and guilt free from the little boy, and his wails replaced Isabella's. I shouldn't have left you there like that. I shouldn't have. It was stupid, but it was my stupid, not yours. That wasn't your fault. It wasn't. Peter looked around the kitchen and shrank into the slats of the chair.
Inez will be mad.
It was true. Maggie knew it in her bones as she looked around the yogurt-splattered kitchen. This could well come at the cost of her job. Well, you let me worry about Inez. What? Did the Pepto-Bismol explode? Maggie spun so fast she nearly sent all three of them crashing off the chair. He stood in the kitchen doorway, hands on hips, surveying the mess. Keith. He'd only been by to talk to Jeffrey about the yard for the engagement party. He hadn't even intended to stop in and say hi. But when screams erupt and you're the one in charge, you come running. Behind him, he heard Jeffrey's hard, disgusted sigh. However, whether she was thinking when she did it or not didn't matter at the moment. What mattered was that all three of them looked like they were about to be thrown out permanently, and they knew it. They shrunk backward away from his presence. He stepped farther into the kitchen, turned toward the counter, and shook his head in consternation. What happened? It was my fault. Maggie stood shakily, placing herself between him and the children. We were going to make smoothies. I left them over here, and the blender got turned on. It's my fault. I should have been watching them closer. Smoothie splatters streaked down her blue blouse, across her hair, and down her face. In fact, it was everywhere. Things happened. Keith knew that as well as anybody. However, he also knew there were people in this place who wouldn't take that for a reason. Okay, why don't you take the kids upstairs, hose them off, get them into clean clothes, whatever it takes. Jeffrey and I will get this mess cleaned up. He heard Jeffrey's grunt of disapproval, but with one glance backward, he silenced any protest. Twisting, Maggie picked Isabella up even as she kept her gaze on Keith. Are you sure? I don't want to get you into trouble. Let me worry about that. You take care of them. A wary nod, and Maggie herded the children out and up the stairs. Keith turned to Jeffrey, who looked positively mortified. Come on, we'd better get this place cleaned up before the she-wolves get back. Upstairs, Maggie did her best to calm the children down. Isabella was the easiest. With a quick slide through the bathtub, clean clothes, and her bed, coupled with the intense crying of earlier, the little girl was asleep in no time. Peter, on the other hand, was a different story. He watched her carefully. Every move she made, he seemed to cringe back from her in fear. In the bath, when she went to put the soap on him, he backed away a full inch before she caught hold of him. Hey, Peter boy. Where are you going? It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. See, we're just going to wash all this icky old yogurt off so you're all nice and clean. She kept talking in that sing-song voice that kids melted into. It didn't help him, but it sure helped her. When Peter made it out of the tub and dressed, Maggie took him in the rocking chair, wondering about what was going on downstairs. However, as deadly to her job as that sounded, she had to trust that they would do the best they could. Whatever happened after that would happen. What in the wide world? Inez stopped cold in the doorway to the kitchen. Keith held up his hand that sported the little rope around his wrist as he stood on the chair, wiping yogurt from the ceiling. I can explain. Inez swung the bags onto the counter. Well, somebody better. Look at these mess. He surveyed his options, took a breath, and plunged ahead. I didn't have lunch. I was just going to grab something quick. I didn't realize the blender was on when I plugged it in. He felt Jeffrey's gaze on him, but he kept going. We were hoping to have it cleaned up before you got here. She didn't look at all pleased. Well, that worked. Don't worry about it. We'll get it. It was clear she wanted to yell at him, but the hierarchy of the situation dawned on her, and she backed off. Fine, but these mess had better be clean before dinner. It will be, no problem. Maggie was still rocking Peter in the chair an hour later. Her cheek rested on his head, and she knew he was asleep. Poor kid. She'd about scared him to death. The soft creak of the door brought her thoughts up from the sleeping child. Keith stuck his head in, and she gasped softly. Keith, how's... He put his fingers to his lips, glanced back out into the hallway, and then stepped in before closing the door quietly behind him. Making no noise at all, he tiptoed over to where she sat. She surveyed him seriously. How's downstairs? Clean, finally. We've got the curtains in the wash right now. Everything else is done. She sighed in relief, and the chair started rocking again. But he didn't leave. Instead, he sat on his heel next to the rocking chair and brushed his thumb under his nose. Listen, Inez came home and about had a conniption. Maggie's eyes widened in fear and then closed as she shook her head. I'm dead. No, that's what I came up here to tell you. I took the rap for you. Her gaze smashed into his as she tried to understand what he was telling her. You what? Why? Gentle and compassionate, he gazed at her, his deep brown eyes setting her spirit on solid ground. She can be a little harsh if things aren't just right, so I told her I did it. So long as you don't say anything, she'll never know. Gratefulness for his chivalry traced through her, but still, he'd put himself out there to get yelled at, or worse. But why? Why would you do that? It was my fault. Hey, things happen. He shrugged, then reached over and ran his hand over Peter's head. Besides, these two need you more than I need my skin. With a tight smile, he stood, and her gaze followed him up. Will you be back for dinner tonight? He nodded ever so slightly. I wouldn't miss it. Chapter 5. Is she asleep? Keith stepped up behind Maggie as she closed Isabella's door. In the first second, Maggie jumped. In the second, she nodded, feeling the security his presence brought her all the way to her core. Too much excitement today. I hear you there. He followed her across the hall, and she felt his every move. You going to tuck Peter in? Yeah. Mind if I come along? He was leaning against the wall, shoulder to wrist. The hat and bandana were gone again, which wasn't helping her breathing any. If you want. She pushed the door to Peter's room open, and without waiting for him to follow, she walked over to the bed. However, when she got there, the first thing she noticed was the tears on the little face, and concern poured over her. Peter boy, what's wrong? Sad, heart-wrenching eyes gazed up at her.
You're not leaving, are you?
Leaving? She knelt down next to the bed and took his hand in hers, forgetting anyone else was in the room with them. Why would I be leaving?
Because of what we did?
His little lip quivered.
I'm sorry. I didn't know Isabella was going to touch that button.
Oh, baby. Compassion for him slid through her. Baby, come here. He sat up and fell into her arms, hugging her like she'd never been hugged before.
I don't want you to go.
Hey. She stroked his head as his desperation pulled her closer to him. Shh, it's okay. It's not your fault, remember?
But I don't want you to leave.
Hey, slugger. Keith knelt down on the other side of the bed, and Maggie looked at him through the darkness. He reached across the bed and ran his hand over Peter's back. Maggie's not going anywhere. I'm going to make sure of that. How he could sound so sure, she didn't know. But Peter sniffed and backed up from her. Still leaning on her, he looked at Keith.
Really?
Really. Now, you get on to sleep. Tomorrow's another day, and maybe we'll go horseback riding again if you want. A breath of excitement punched through the sadness.
Really?
Yeah, but only if you get some sleep now. Peter scooted back down under the covers, and Maggie helped him pull them up around him. However, when he was settled, she wasn't sure what to do next. You want to say it? Keith asked her when she didn't start immediately. Although it was more than her brain could handle, she nodded. She reached down and took Peter's hand in hers, and then, from across the bed, Keith offered her his. Her heart slammed into her chest as she looked at it for 1 second, and then forced herself to remember his generosity earlier in the afternoon. She laid her hand in his. Rough, but strong, just like him. It supported hers effortlessly. Trying not to think about it, she bent her head. Dear Lord, we thank you tonight for all the good things you did for us today. We ask you to send your saints and angels to be with us tonight. Keep us safe, hold us in your love, and be with us always. Amen. Amen. The deep voice and the soft one blended together, sending her heart into fits. Good night, sweet prince. She pulled her hand back, bent forward, and kissed Peter's forehead. You get some sleep. Let Jesus take care of everything else. On the other side of the bed, Keith stood. He reached one hand down to the little shoulder. Night, slugger. Maggie pushed to her feet and turned for the door. 3 steps, and she felt his presence right behind her. It was comforting and anxiety-producing at the same time. At the door, Keith opened it for her, and they stepped into the hallway. Once there, he slid the door into the jamb and turned to her. I think you've got a fan, he whispered. Yeah, well, a lot of good that's going to do me. If the day had convinced her of anything, it was that she could never be perfect enough for this place. Someday, some way, she would do something just wrong enough to be fired, and it wouldn't even have to be as major as yogurt on the ceiling. Her heart ripped in half at the thought of leaving these kids, of breaking their hearts by walking away. It would kill her, as surely as it would kill them. I gotta go. Night. Hey. His hand, coming around her wrist, stopped her from escaping into her room. What's wrong? Sniffing the misery down, she turned to him, but her gaze was on the carpet. Let's face it. I'm not cut out for this place. It's obvious. I'm not used to schedules and dressing fancy and soccer lessons and piano lessons. Mrs. Malinowski's was nothing like this. I don't know how to do any of this right. Beaten down by the need to appear perfect in a too-perfect world, she looked ready to admit defeat. Keith knew exactly where she was coming from. He'd been there. Well, it looks to me like you're doing something right. Those kids love you, Maggie,
And you've only been here, what? A week?
Yeah, she laughed sarcastically. And I'll only be here, what, 4 more days? She wrapped her arms over her middle, and one hand drifted up to wipe the tears from under her glasses. Face it, I'm not good enough to be here. I couldn't be if I tried. Okay, now you stop right there. He picked his hand up and held up his index finger. First of all, you have done more for those 2 kids than anyone has since they've been on the planet. Second of all, you are perfect just the way you are. She actually laughed at him that time. Yeah, right. Look at me. I've worn the same shirt for 3 days now because I don't have the guts to ask if I can use the washer, nor do I even know where it is. I got reamed out the other day because we were only 2 minutes early to dinner. And with today's stunt, well, let's just say it's only a matter of time. Keith shook his head at the list. Wait a minute. Back up. They didn't show you the house? You don't know where the washer is? Embarrassment tramped across her face. It took her more than a few seconds, but finally she sighed. They warned me not to go snooping around, so I didn't want to go looking on my own. Oh, well, that one's easy enough. He reached over and took hold of her wrist. Come with me. With her trailing him like a bike with a kickstand down, they took the kitchen stairs to the bottom level. In the kitchen, he turned to the right instead of to the left and opened a small door. He flipped the light on, and there, in gleaming white, was the washer and dryer. Ta-da! Now, was that really so hard? She fought the smile as long as she could, but finally it broke through. Good. Problem number 1 solved. He turned to her. Now, my next question is how you got to the end of your clothing supply in less than a week. Leaning against the open door and making circles on the floor with her toe that he realized was sticking out the front of her white sock, she kept her gaze on the floor. Because I brought everything I owned. It was all in that suitcase, the one we carried from the barn. Incredulousness dropped over him. Everything you owned was in there? How that could possibly be, he didn't know, because that suitcase weighed next to nothing. I was headed back to Mrs. Malinowski's when the dean called me about this job, and Mrs. Ayer didn't really give me the chance to get anything new once I got here. Not that I could have. I had $2 to my name the day I showed up. Still do. Processing all that she was telling him was getting harder by the minute. Okay, wait a minute. Time out, one thing at a time. Who is Mrs. Malinowski? Maggie fought the humiliation rising in her chest. Sure, there was nothing to be embarrassed about, but still, people always reacted so strangely when they knew. The forcefulness of his voice was gone, and he softened. Maggie? Hey, it's okay, you can tell me. She glanced up at him, and his face held nothing but compassion and concern. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and willed the wall to hold her up. She's my foster mom, or she was until I turned 18. Foster mom? He shook his head, a half shake. I don't understand. Willing the tears to stay in her heart, Maggie detached herself from the story as she had learned to do so long before. My parents were killed in a car accident when I was 8. She set her jaw and lifted her chin to show him she was over that tragedy. There weren't any relatives to take me, and they hadn't named any guardians in the will, so I went into the foster care system. Oh, Maggie, I'm sorry. She shrugged slightly. It's not that big of a deal. It was okay. At least it was once I got to Mrs. Malinowski's house. She was really great. She had 6 of us, all foster kids. It was chaos. But it was okay, because she loved us. The worry in his eyes drilled through her when she glanced up at him. Her gaze fell again. She fought to pull it back up to his. She didn't want him to think that she was damaged goods or anything. How long were you at Mrs.? He asked softly. Malinowski, 4 years, 14 to 18. Then the state kicked me out, and I was on my own for good.
The state kicked you out? She shrugged with one shoulder. It's the rules. When you get to be 18, good luck. See ya. She waved her hand as if making a joke. I got lucky, though. I got a scholarship at Kingsville, so it worked out. She stifled the yawn that attacked her. Slowly, she pulled her hand up to her hair and slid it sideways through it to the back. I know what it's like to grow up thinking nobody cares. Her smile was sad. That's why I wanted this to work out so bad. He regarded her for a long moment. Yeah, I can see that. This time, she really did yawn. Man, I'm done for. I'd better get up there. We've got dance and art lessons in the morning. Oh, joy, he said, trying to laugh. More lessons. Tell me about it. I have never seen two kids with such tight schedules. They make Donald Trump look like a bum. With a push to get her going, she started up the stairs as he snapped off the light behind them. He was climbing behind her, of that she was sure. She could feel him there. As she climbed, she knew she had to say what was in her heart, and here, in the dark, she had just enough distance from it to be able to say the word. Thanks. Thanks? For what? He sounded surprised. For what? Yeah, right. Well, let's see. For not letting me faceplant that first day in the foyer? For carrying my suitcase for a mile so my arms wouldn't drop off? For taking us horseback riding? Although I'm still trying to recover from that one. She pulled herself up the top stair. Oh, yeah, and for putting your neck on the line for me today. You didn't have to do that, you know. At her door, she stopped and turned toward him. His smile was more sad and concerned than she had ever seen it. I'm glad I did. For one single moment, all seemed right with the world. Then tension and awkwardness descended between them. Well, I'd better get some shut-eye, he said, pointing past her to the darkened hallway beyond. Yeah, you and me both. Her hand rested on the knob as she leaned her head on the door and gazed up at him. Thanks, Keith. No problem. It was nearly 5 a.m. before Keith got to sleep. He had to do something, speak up, tell his father about her. But how? It was a question that would be with him the rest of the weekend.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.